Hi everyone, my name is Ziyi. Together with me is Putri. Today we will talk about the regulatory approach in Singapore. The aim of our presentation today is to critically evaluate Singapore's regulatory approach to digital payment tokens by reference to the Payment Services Act 2019 and other related legislation and guidelines. First, we will outline Singapore's regulatory framework for digital assets, focusing on intermediary-based licensing regime under the Payment Services Act. Next, we will evaluate this framework through competing regulatory philosophies. Lastly, we will examine the policy justification for regulation and offer a critical assessment of the strength and weaknesses of Singapore model.
Okay, so Singapore's regulatory framework for digital assets. Singapore mainly regulates their digital assets primarily through the Payment Service Act 2019 or the PSA. Under Section 2, they define digital payment token as a digital representation of value that is expressed as a unit and is not in itself a nominated currency, but the token itself is intended to be used and function as a medium of exchange. The digital payment token also can be electronically transferred. They can also be electronically stored and traded. So this definition is aimed to be technologically neutral and sufficiently broad enough to capture most definition of digital assets or currency like cryptocurrencies. So the PSA 2019 itself imposes a licensing on the intermediaries rather than on the tokens themselves. So entities dealing in digital payment token services such as brokers and custodians must obtain either a standard payment institution license or major payment institution license, depending on the scale of their business and the risk of the exposure. Licensed providers are subjected to stringent AML and CFT obligation, that is anti-money laundering and counterfeit against terrorism obligation, governance and risk management. The framework also further reinforced by the Financial Services and Market Act 2022 or FSMA that extends the Singapore's monetary authorities supervisory reach to encapsulates entities that is incorporated in Singapore that provides a digital payment token service overseas.
So from a theoretical perspective, regulatory responses to digital asset can be understood along a spectrum of regulatory intensity. So at one end of the spectrum lies prohibition, where cryptocurrency-related activities are banned outright, usually due to their concerns over their financial stability, consumer harm, or monetary sovereignty. At the opposite end is non-regulation, where the state deliberately refrain from intervention and allow market forces and private ordering to govern behavior. Between these two extremes are the various intermediate models, including selective or partial regulation, or selective prohibition or stage regulation. So Singapore approach sits within the middle of the regulatory spectrum, avoiding both prohibition and non-regulation. Singapore adopts a selective regulation targeting centralized intermediaries while leaving the underlying blockchain technology largely untouched. This reflects a pragmatic recognition that although blockchains are decentralized, economic activity around them is often highly centralized. At the same time, Singapore's regime also reflects a staged approach to regulation, where regulatory requirement increase as scale, risk, and market maturity increase. This is reflected in the two-tier licensing framework under which standard payment institutions are subject to lighter obligation, while major payment institutions face more stringent requirements due to their larger transaction volumes and higher potential risks.
Next, we will have a little critique from a libertarian or a crypto anarchist point of view. Singapore's approach might be criticized as contradicting the blockchain's original idea of flex cryptographia, where self-governing code replaces state law and regulation. By regulating intermediaries, Singapore clearly rejects this ideology, reflecting the monetary authorities of Singapore's point of view that to protect the user and public interest, code alone is insufficient because code alone is not enough to manage risks such as fraud or consumer harm. This reflects a skeptical view of technological libertarianism and shows insistence that law remains necessary even in a decentralized system.
So the next question is why there's a need to regulate, especially in a space often linked to decentralization and autonomy. So first, it can be argued that regulation is important to address market failure and protect consumers and investors. Digital asset markets are highly volatile and vulnerable to fraud, and retail participants often lack the expertise to properly assess risks such as technical risks, operational risks, and custodial risks. In these circumstances, reliance on caveat emptor alone is insufficient to ensure adequate protection. Next, regulation is also motivated by concerns about stability and integrity of the financial system. Singapore's approach is also aiming at preventing money laundering and terrorism financing. Finally, regulation plays a trust-building role. Through licensing and supervision, Singapore authorities can create a credible and orderly market that supports responsible innovation while deterring different kinds of misconducts. This is consistent with Singapore's broader goal of maintaining its reputation as a trusted financial hub.
Okay. Next, we will evaluate the strengths and weaknesses. The principal strength of Singapore approach lies in their realistic view of market practicality. I think the authorities avoid leading towards extreme ideologies like technological libertarianism by adopting regulatory frameworks that can ideally function in the market and be applied in practice, especially since Singapore is a business-oriented country. Next is that the combination of PSA 2019, FMSA 2022, and MAS guidelines creates a coherent framework that promotes financial integrity and regulatory stability while remaining open to further innovation and future development of digital assets.
However, it should be noted that there are some limitation. First, the focus of intermediary can cause some regulatory blind spots as the decentralization deepens. More digital asset activities may occur through decentralized protocols and smart contracts that operate without a central operator or an identifiable legal entity. As users interact directly with these systems, traditional regulatory tools that rely on licensing, supervision, and enforcement against intermediaries become less effective. Secondly, high compliance costs may deter smaller innovators. Third, extraterritorial regulation under the FMSA, while conceptually sound, may also face some practical enforcement challenges. To conclude, Singapore regulatory approach to digital assets reflects a selective, progressive, and risk-based philosophies, which aims to promote market integrity and innovation while balancing consumer protection. While this approach may fall short of libertarian ideals and face challenges as decentralization advances, it represents a credible attempt to govern digital assets within the realities of modern financial system. So with that, we end our presentation. Thank you.